Good night, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event. My name is Nicola Gavioli. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages. Tonight we have a very special lecture. I'm very happy to have Professor Jaime Ginzburg with us. This lecture is part of the Modern Languages Graduate Seminar Series organized by the Modern Languages Department, the School of International Public Affairs, and co-sponsored by LAC, Latin American Caribbean Center at FIU. I would like to thank you, everybody here, in particular our chair, the chair of our department, Pascal Bessel, who really make this event possible. My colleagues, students, Steven Batterman of the University of Miami, thank you very much for coming. And I would like to say a few words about Jaime Ginzburg, our speaker. Jaime Ginzburg is professor of Brazilian literature and literary theory at the University of São Paulo, USP. Currently, he teaches as a visiting scholar at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of numerous essays published on academic journals and books. Among his latest published works, the book Crítica em Tempos de Violência, and the edition together with Sabrina Sedlemeyer of Walter Benjamin, Rastus, Aurora e Aura História. The title of his talk is Narrative, Memory, and Ruins. We're going to have a presentation and followed by a Q&A of 10-15 minutes. And I would like also to remember that this lecture is going to be recorded and it will be posted on the website of the Modern Languages Department under lectures. So you can hear again on our website. So, Professor Ginzburg, por favor. Muito obrigado.
So, is this okay? Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming here. I would like to say thank you for the university for having me. This is very generous, is very important. And it's nice to see Professor Steven again. And I want to thank especially for Professor Nicola, who made a major effort to bring me here. And it's very good to see a group of people interested in this discussion. I hope you can find something useful in what I'm going to present. And I will be very glad if you bring questions and contributions when I finish my speech. To talk about narrative and memory is kind of a challenge, and I know somehow I might find a way to talk about Brazil that is relevant to your knowledge of how is Brazil nowadays, what is the contemporary situation. But I'd like to talk first about the concept of memory and to point out some issues on that matter. And after that, then, talk about Brazil and Latin America for a while. So the speech is going to have two parts. So I'd like to start by asking what should we consider when we talk about how do we deal with memory, both in individual situation and in collective situation, meaning that we assume in the common sense that we can actually articulate consciously our memory, that we can decide what is important or not in our past, and we can organize our episodes of the past in a way that is convenient and is meaningful for us. Actually, this kind of conscious connection with our memory and our past is an illusion, meaning that we have in the common sense a kind of a self-protection from the state of instability that is what is in fact our connection with our own memory. We have like fragments of the past in our interior. They are articulated in many, many ways. They might appear to our perception in a variety of situations. And the idea that we can control our memory, we can define what is relevant or not, and how can we organize our past in the way that we can feel comfortable with that. This idea is like self-protection from the sense of trauma that can be nuclear to what happened with us as a group and as individuals in the past. What I'm saying here is that the common sense about memory does not include the sense of memory of pain and the memory of suffering. When we organize our memory in the common everyday life, it's likely that you think about the past as a comfortable process that brings us to what we are in the present, what we are now. And therefore, memory would work like a process that is an unity, it is very coherent, very consistent. And for example, for those who like to read the horoscope and to deal with astrology, we have the sense that our personality is like always the same, and is a personality that is not only stable but also repetitive. It's a personality that can be predictable, that we can imagine all the time what is going to happen with us because of the past. And if you include pain in this equation and you consider how we deal with memories of suffering, that stability is not possible, because the very principle of the memory is that since memory is connected to self-protection, that memory is an instance of search for identity, quest for self-knowledge. What happens is that we repress a lot of elements of our past, and this repression is part of the process of self-protection. And sometimes we cannot control this process of repression, and memories can appear unpredictably and show us the sense of suffering that we have been repressing. So actually what we do is to pretend that we don't have so much pain as we actually have in the past. When you talk about collective memory, this is particularly important because, for example, nowadays we have a lot of discussions on post-colonial contexts. If you go to discussions on South America, on Argentina, on Brazil, on Africa, the history of the colonial process is very important. And if you actually pay attention to all the impact of the colonial process in these places, you find a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in a collective perspective. And you cannot actually construct a society if you pay attention only for this pain and suffering. To construct a society, you have to add an affirmative perspective, assuming that this society is capable of overcoming limitations and overcoming pain. But there are situations when the suffering of the past is stronger than we are. And in these situations, we have to confront the pain of the past, and we have to deal with that some way. a lot of people have, for example, nightmares when situations of pain, situations of trauma appear unexpectedly, and you might, for example, in your bed just get up sweating because you are confronting some uncomfortable memory. And this is like your body saying that you have the pain inside and you cannot actually repress all the time. What I'm trying to tell you is that memory, as an instance of the behavior, is a construction that we may deal with by illusion, by some distortions, and we construct memory as far as it's convenient and it's comfortable for us. But inside us, we have forces of the representations of the past that might be somehow stronger than us and stronger than the process of repression. So when you have traumatic situations, and if you think, for example, in a rape, in an individual situation, or you think about a genocide in a collective situation, right? When you have trauma, it's very hard to define a comfortable memory. So it's not likely that somebody who has a rape in the past might assume in everyday life that this is the past that is possible to have. So it's necessary to construct an image of the past that might overcome the strength of this pain, the hard difficulty to deal with sufferance. Because if a person who passed through rape thinks only about that, being only connected to the memory of pain, or physical pain, this might lead this person to a collapse, a psychological collapse that maybe will not ever be able to be overcome. So how can you talk about your past in a way that you don't deny every pain, every suffering that you have, but at the same time you can affirm your identity, you can affirm who you are, and you can put a perspective on the future. There's the research nowadays on memory, or at least a part of it, is about narrative, is about how you construct a narrative of your past, as a collective past or an individual past. And what is the way, the proper way to organize a narrative of the past? For example, if you go to a library and you get any book with history of in the title, you might expect that in this book you have the organization of the past of a specific society. So História do Brasil might present you in a very proper way what is the past of Brazil and what is important in this past. But as far as we understand today in contemporary studies, this construction is always not only partial because it's a selection, but in many cases this construction of the history of the past of a country or a society is working with exclusion and deliberated exclusion. Then you will find a lot of books on history of the United States or history of Latin America, in which the participation of some groups, some parts of society, some elements of the dynamics of the social conflicts are excluded, are absent, because the politics of memory nowadays is actually a politics of oblivion. We have institutions like schools, like universities, like publisher houses, and we have politicians and we have lawyers and judges who are interested in specific constructions of the past organized in a way that we might not see, not understand what is the painful, the hard, the contradictory part of social experience. So what happens in this situation is that we have to go far beyond the textbooks, we have to go far beyond the conventional narratives of the past, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we tell the story of the past in a way that you don't deny all the pain and the suffering? For example, one very important ongoing discussion is about the memory of the concentration camps, the memory of the Holocaust. And in this discussion, one perspective that is very strong and very consecrated today is that you cannot actually talk about the Holocaust as a process of cause and effect. You cannot give a logic for the Holocaust. You cannot treat the Holocaust as a trivial situation or like a predictable situation. Because the consequence of that is that if you know the causes of the Holocaust and you have the causes presented again in a similar situation, you can assume that the Holocaust will happen again. And what is being demanded now is that we have some ethical perspective on the memory in a way that we talk about the Holocaust assuming that it's not going to happen again, that we are going to do anything that we can to avoid this repetition. So the very way that we talk about the subject is already a way to assume a position that is against or as in favor of the possibility of the repetition of the extreme violence. So if you get into an ethics of the memory, you get into the problem of the empathy that is very, very important in this matter. For example, today, if you have a person who passed through trauma, and this person comes to you and talks about all the pain in his or her life, you listen. What is the correct reaction for that? When you are presented to the memory of the other, and this memory is painful and is hard, what is the proper way to say something in recognition of the pain of the other? According, for example, to Susan Sontag and other intellectuals that dedicated studies on this, the point is that our society is very frightened of empathy. Our society not only is individualist and competitive, but more than that is a society where our vulnerability is so hard to deal with that we actually cannot deal with the vulnerability of the other. So if we listen to news, and in the news we hear things like, for example, there is a genocide of indigenous people. There are like 6,000 Indians being killed in Brazil for the last months. If you pay attention on that and you have empathy, you might have a very sensitive reaction, and you might feel sad and angry, and you might react with a sense that something might be done. But this is a reaction that it's not the expected reaction, because if you understand this as in a psychoanalytical way, if we would care for every pain that we take notice of, we actually will collapse as psychical structures. We are not prepared to deal with the amount of pain that the news on television are bringing to us. It's too much. So the common inclination, the usual inclination, would be not to have empathy with anything. And that's very, very bad, that we don't have any empathy with the pain of the other. So when we listen to a person with trauma, we have to assume not only an ethical attitude and generosity, but we might understand that a person with trauma and a trauma that we don't share, for example, that a person passed through some pain that we don't know how it is. It's very important to understand that is the role of the listener is to understand the language of this person that might be a very different language from the language that we use everyday life. For example, I searched for some years some depositions of survivors of persecution in dictatorship in Brazil. People who were tortured, they were in police stations and tortured for a long time, and somehow they survived, and they gave interviews on how was that. And as far as I could understand, these people have some patterns of expression, and these patterns are very strange to our everyday life. For example, it's likely that somebody who was tortured for a long time would not use properly the pronoun I, the pronoun of first person. It's very common that victims of torture talk about themselves using second or third person, like você levando porrada na cabeça. The person talks about him or herself as it's a different person, and in a third person as well, like he or she, and not I. Another important matter is the reference of time. It's very likely that victims of torture cannot actually structure time as we do. And the sequence of episodes, like this happened before, this happened later, this is the cause, this is the effect, is not the pattern. The pattern will be to have images of simultaneity of different moments of time. And what we would consider contradiction is the best explanation possible coming from a victim of torture. So when we listen to a person with trauma, we need to understand that someone who has immense pain, excruciating pain, physically or not, someone who has excruciating pain has, in some level, possibly, probably, a collapse of the connection between the language and the body. So it's like saying someone who was tortured relate the scenes of torture through the word fala, the word speak, right? And it's likely that this person, when he or she hears this word again in other contexts, might feel uncomfortable, might feel something bad, just because of the presence of this little part of that experience, right? So to deal with memory, considering ethics, considering empathy, demands an effort, demands work. And what we see nowadays is that in most situations, people don't have even the patience to give empathy, to give generosity to listening. And researchers who are dealing, for example, with testimony now in Latin America, in Argentina mostly, they have this problem that they actually made this effort to have written what happened in a situation of dictatorship, how was the persecution, how mothers feel about the loss of their sons and daughters. But they don't have the audience they expect, meaning that people don't buy these books, people don't go to these conferences. They are like tired or are like in denial of dealing with the past of the country. So there is this hard thing on the memory of pain that people usually are not prepared to listen properly. They are not prepared to consider the pain of the other as his or her own pain. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in Philosophical Investigations, wrote great things about this matter. According to him, it's amazing that we have a possibility to give a variety of words for things from everyday life. For example, fruit. We can have like 10 names for different kinds of apples. But if you're going to say that you have an injury in your shoulder, or you're going to say that you are very sad because you lost a son, or you're going to say that you have like a little headache that don't pass and you cannot work, all of these experiences can be expressed by only this word, pain. Right? I have pain, and it is expected that the person who listens to that actually don't understand what's going on. And everybody has an individual and a flexible idea of what is pain. So to understand the pain of the other actually is very, very hard to achieve. Am I talking too fast or something? No? Okay. So therefore, if we go to cultural studies and literary theory, we have to consider the problem of the narrative. How can you talk about the past in a way that you can obtain empathy from the other? How can we talk about the past in a way that we don't deny our pain, but at the same time, we don't collapse in face of the pain? Like we learn to deal with that, and we learn to try to overcome, even if this is actually impossible. So I could say that the problem of the narrative is a very important problem, because we are expected to understand narrative as a linear process, a very organized process, when you can find cause and effect, you can find the connections between one fact and the other. And you organize by date, you organize by space, you organize by movement. You collect the elements of the past and you construct a narrative that can present in a very meaningful way what happened. But if you go to testimony and you go to narratives related to excruciating pain and big suffering, for example, melancholic narratives from people who lost their loved ones, what happens is the fragmentation of the narrative. And this sense of an organized order is not present anymore. And what we see is a dissociative language that gives us the sense that nothing is stable. The narrative of the pain, the melancholic narrative of the pain, is something that show how weak words can be, because if you go, for example, study linguistics, right? You learn that words should refer to something, right? That the word house should refer to a certain space that you can live in, and there is a convention that the word should mean something and should refer to that object. What happens in the melancholic narrative of pain is that this referential function of language fails. And the language is not there to refer to something concrete. In the opposite, the language is in there to show the difficulty of talking. And if you go, for example, to videos that I understand that you have in the internet, videos from survivors from the Holocaust, they try to talk about the camps, and they try to organize a perspective on how can you imagine the vision of the camps. Actually, there is a lot of meaning in the points that the person cannot talk. The person has doubts, like saying, I don't remember exactly if it was that or it was this. I've been working with my students in Minneapolis with a video of a survivor of the Holocaust who says that at some point he was so exhausted of not eating and have the trabalhos forçados, how do you say in English? Forced labor. That because of that, he was hallucinating, right? So there is a point in the narrative that you cannot actually say when the hallucination started and when it's ended. So it's like listening to the whole story and then not having any kind of assurance that he actually saw what he says he saw. So this is very common in narrative from people who were seriously damaged. They actually don't have what we would expect as Cartesian thought, rational thought of cause and effect. A lot of that is intuition, is about fragments that come and go, and about versions of the past that will never actually be concluded. So in this video of a survivor of the Holocaust, you see that when this guy is going to talk about something that is extremely painful for him, like having like a week without any food, he stops and his breath changes and the rhythm of the narrative changes. And you see that the pain is constitutive of the narrative. So it's not only the subject, but is also the way he talks is pain. So I would say that we are still searching. I mean, we academics, researchers, we are still searching for concepts and theory and appropriate ways to talk about this kind of narrative. Because, for example, if you are in the field of cultural studies, literary studies, or history, and you look at this material with a canonic perspective, like expecting that this should be like what the tradition brought to us as narrative, you might say this is a failure, this is not a narrative that we can rely on, so this doesn't count, right? But what I'm saying here is actually that the absence of a consistent narrative is in itself a matter of research. This is something that is challenging us because we never had in history, we don't have any precedent for that, a quantity of information about pain as we have today, of collective pain and individual pain. We never had so many files on psychiatry that we can access. We never had so many files on people in institutions like prisons and what happens in there. We never had so much information about human rights. And actually we are not, we as universities, we are not enough prepared to deal with all this information. And for example, I think I was talking to Nicola about this this morning. People who research peace, right, peace studies, might find it today in journals on peace, like that you might expect that this will be like empathy and the criticism of violence and a sense of measure that peace is something good, right? Journals on peace nowadays are journals of mathematics mostly. It's about equations considering how can you calculate the quantity of civilians that might die in different scenarios. So peace studies are mostly studies on levels of violence. You don't have actually the hypothesis of a peaceful society for long term. And that means that the idea of empathy as a key to peace studies is actually not dominant, it will be the exception. So, now talking about Brazil, what happens if you think about memory in Brazil and how to tell the story of the past of Brazil? I would give as a start the perspective of Florestan Fernandes, who was a major social scientist in Brazil. He wrote a remarkable book on social changes, and the question of the book was, well, what's specific in Brazil, or at least what is the thing that should be expected and it's not there, that makes our society so unequal, right? And why is this something that is continuous and growing? So in his research, that is like based in very objective data and statistics and also data from economy and from the history of politics, what he understands is that we have a constitutive ambiguity in Brazil, that in the 20th century we have a process of modernization, and we were very successful, and this is ongoing right now. The process of having a successful industry and urbanization and big cities that can deal with complex economic systems, and also population that might work in a proper way and contribute. So we have a very successful modernization. We are like now, as you might know, a leader in what was considered in like 20 years ago the third world and the world of the subordinate, the subaltern. But what happens is that the political discourse defending this modernization was always referring to the fact that we are going to get a point when everybody in the country had quality of life. Everybody would have a good house, everybody would have a good job, everybody might be sane and safe, and then just enjoy life. This was the propaganda that, especially in the 50s, was very, very common. And actually what happens in Brazil is the opposite. As much as our modernization grew, the distance between rich and poor grew. And the inequality then came like a monster in the social situation. And this is actually ongoing as well, that you might listen to things like, yeah, this is a very good period to Brazil because we have like a middle class that is very, very successful right away. This is like an illusion if you listen to this kind of image, this kind of idea. The misery in Brazil is changing, of course, but is not being eliminated. We have a series of genocides going on right now, and they have directly or indirectly support from a variety of levels of government. And we cannot assume that our society is like having common interest and a common sense of what is priority. So Floresta Fernandes tried to understand, well, how can we believe in that? How can we believe in a project of a country that, that at the same time can develop this level of modernization, but can just expand poverty without any limits? And the interpretation that he gives, and I recommend you to read his book, is that Brazil is a specific case, and it's possible that would be a singular case in the whole planet, where people enjoy to continue acting like in colonial times. What he means is that in most of the countries, if we have a colonial past as imperialists or as colonies, we try to overcome that in many ways, and we try to build a structured society, democracy. And in Brazil, bosses still act like their workers are slaves. Professors still act like students were expendable, and fathers still act like female the doctors were supposed to be repressed all the time, and things like this. Meaning that the colonial attitude of the repression as a continuous process that is supposed to be respected, this is still there. And in Brazilian culture, we have a lot of situations when you can find, for example, a writer dedicated to the present, a writer talking about contemporary issues, and suddenly in a sentence comes an image of the colonial times, and then the present and the past are crossing in a way that is disturbing. And what we have is a process of phantasmagory, a process of like having this horror, these horrible things of the past appearing unexpectedly in the cultural production of the present. Another professor called Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, who is a disciple of Floresta Fernandes, a student, Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro wrote that not only Floresta Fernandes is right, but actually some colonial habits are more intense in contemporary culture. And for example, some attitudes that in the colonial times were related to exploitation, to a predatory attitude in face of the resources of the land. This is continuing. This is still happening in the capitalist context of industry. So we have actually a lot of evidence of this sense that workers are treated as slaves in many, many ways. And actually, I'm talking like slavery. I'm talking as slavery was ended, and it's not. We have in the north of the country, we have a lot of farms where we can find slaves right now. So, for example, there is a writer called Caio Fernando Abreu. Some of you might know him. He wrote a short story in the contemporary scene and that is a guy talking to his mother and having difficulties to talk about his sexuality and his experience of the body. And in the middle of the conversation, then the mother says that it's like she's having Alzheimer and she's having like unexpected memories of the past. And she remembers a little girl called Candida. And what she says at this moment is, well, she was good for being a black, right? She was almost like a white. This is a small example of something that is very, very common in contemporary cultural production, that you have this sense of a presence of some horror of the past, and this presence is incorporated to the contemporary perspective. So the discussion of matters like homophobia and AIDS in this book is pointing out the problem of the exclusion of the black in the 19th century. So if we follow Floresta Fernandes and Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, what we find is a society that is constituted by an ambiguity. That is that we have a vision of Brazil as nationalist and militarist. That is that Brazil is always the país do futuro, is always in progress, and everything is going to turn fine in the end. But we have also this other side that is brought by the cultural production, that is saying that actually all of that is an illusion. The whole nationalism of Brazil is an illusion. All this image constructed over carnival, soccer, and other mythologies is like a surface to repress what is actually important. That is the extreme violence of society now and in the past. So to talk about the past of Brazil gives us a challenge, that is who can narrate the story? What is the point of view that is appropriate to tell what is our past? So writers like Guimarães Rosa and Clarice Lispector, when they face the problem of talk about the past in Brazil, they present us some narrators, they present us some voices that bring instability to the very act of narrating the past. And that means that at the same time that they talk about important episodes of what happened in Brazil in the past, they also bring the image that all of that past is like a construction that is ongoing and will never actually be concluded. So, for example, in Guimarães Rosa, we have a group of texts that is related to trauma, both related to violence in the sertão in Brazil, and to violence in the Second World War in Germany. And in texts like, for example, his journal on the 40s, Guimarães Rosa wrote in a very fragmented way about how, for example, he didn't accept the violence of the Nazis in Germany, but he also didn't feel good about the bombs that England was throwing in Hamburg, the city that he was living in. And he was working for Brazil in the embassy, and he almost died several times because of these bombs. So we might expect, well, somebody like Guimarães Rosa should be only against the Nazis. And he actually gave help to Jews to get out from Germany at that time. But the point is that since the only solution for that extreme violence was more violence, that England might be really effective with the bombs and with the attacks by planes, Guimarães Rosa was actually in a kind of fragmented perspective, with no sense of right and wrong, no sense of good and evil, and he actually was like in a very claustrophobic place where you cannot rely on anybody and you cannot expect anything from the future. And that's the place that he will construct the point of view in a novel like Grande Sertão Veredas about the violence in Brazil. And Clarice Lispector has as well some strategies on that matter. She wrote a very important text called Carta ao Ministro da Educação that was published in a newspaper and is about the first time in Brazil that we had vestibular. I don't know if you know what vestibular means. Is the process of selection to get into university. And it's a very hard process, and it's just a few people can come into the university, and all the others are excluded from the system. And Clarice Lispector reacted to the point when this appeared, because she was like, well, this is the país do futuro, this is the país of the progresso, everything is being constructed. How can the government impose a rule to exclude all society from education? So she writes this text, and the text includes, for example, a reference of how the students are in pain, but they cannot actually do anything about it. They cannot protest. They cannot write anything, because if they do, they are going to be killed by the government at that time in the late 60s. So she writes, as in a sense of sacrifice of herself, if somebody will be punished, then should be me, the writer. And you, Mr. President, you can consider this text as a social movement of the students. This kind of attitude is not only an attitude of empathy with pain and empathy with the situation of repression, but also is a situation when the sense of the perspective is very, very complex, because it's the writer that is assuming a position, is the voice that is constructed by the writer that had fictional elements that can actually give the sense of impact of what is being discussed. But as the text is saying, the president should not understand this as writing, but as social movement, like the protest in front of the building that will never happen. And the text that she publishes is like the conversation between society and the president that will never happen in the dictatorship. So this kind of text is like, it's not a referential function. It's not about talking about something that we can refer to. It's constructing an image of what we cannot talk about. It's constructing an image of what is repressed by politics and cannot be said. Maybe the best solution, or one of the best solutions to this impasse in Brazil, how can we talk about what is painful and what is suffering and present our past in a proper way, was given by Glauber Rocha, that made several important films like Terra em Transe. The proposition in Glauber Rocha, and he wrote a lot about it, is that if there is a state that we can actually talk about the past in Brazil, is the state of trance, is the state of vertigo, because that's the best possibility of understanding what happened, since what happened is not logical, is not acceptable, and is not something that we might assume as our past with calm and with subordination. So the way to resist to the institutional images of the past and to present how painful and how hard it was, the past in Brazil, is to have a camera and present images on how Brazil was in vertigo, in a way that your eye look at things in a way that it will never be capable of. The camera has to bring images of what's going on in a way that we are not prepared to deal with. And the vertigo of the camera is capable of giving us a distance of the conventional images of the power, and also giving us the possibility to face the horror without having the possibility of being devorated by it, of being a victim of it. So the camera should be in movement all the time, like escaping from any repression, escaping of any sense of control. I'm getting to the end here. I think my time is right. Yeah. So what I'm going to say to close this speech is that we're dealing now with this conflict between the nationalist perspective, that is what the press is more interested in, the image of this Brazil that is right now, 2012, a very important economic center in the South, and that we are capable of overcoming any limitations or any problems. And the fact that we are going to have in Brazil the Olympics and the World Cup is actually the highest priority right now, because this is going to bring a lot of publicity, is going to bring money, is going to bring a sense of centrality to Brazil in the next years, symbolic centrality. But I would insist on the fact that, for example, in São Paulo, the city that I live in, is ongoing right now a systematic genocide of homeless people. And this is not, of course, something that appears in the press all the time. This is something that you know by different ways. And this is a process of hygiene. This is a process of purification of the city, in a way that when people come there as tourists and as fans of sports, they find a city in order, without any dog going in the street, any stain in the highway. And this is the cost of a nationalist perspective. The cost is by eliminating what the government considers as inconvenient, and the value of the singular lives, the value of the lives of the homeless or the indigenous native people, are just part of statistics, are just numbers that might be manipulated in statistics. So we are watching in Brazil now a situation that is what Walter Benjamin would call like a state of catastrophe. And if we are going to have like a big and beautiful stadium for sports in every big city, we might consider, in a perspective of Benjamin, that every monument in there is a document of barbarism, that the cost of this stadium and all this party is blood of living people. And therefore, all this architecture of the big sports, of the party, is actually ruins, is actually a residual collateral effect of the history of violence that we have. Thank you.
much information on pain before? And why would you say that is? Would you say it's because of technology, or just like, you know, as we grow as the human race, there's more introspection, wanting to know more about ourselves? Or, I mean, will it be stronger with the future as more technology comes, or what's your opinion?
Should I answer one by one, or have a block of questions? Or
There are other questions. Maybe we start with
there is somebody in there.
I have a question too, but it's a little different.
Okay, maybe so we go.
Fine. Okay. What I'm saying here is that since we have technology for information as we have with the social networks and the possibilities of databases in internet, we have technical conditions to accumulate information in a way that we never could before. Like the whole idea of archivo, a file, is completely changed, because we don't have actually physical space to all the information we have. We need the digital space, because this is like something that we don't have to confront as a challenge, a physical challenge. But we don't have actually criteria to organize all this information. So, for example, I'll give you a concrete example. We have now, by statistics, by quantitative research, information that 20% of the military in the United States are somehow connected to rape inside the military. So this is a result of statistics. There are some sources for this kind of number. But the research on that involves problems like, for example, people who would talk about being raped inside the military. If they do that, they are punished. And if they do that in like a civil and not as a military, they will be punished more. And especially in the case of when the person who raped is the boss, the one who is giving orders, you create a situation of embarrassment, because actually you won't be able to leave this position, because you have to stay there in that job. So this is a kind of information that we can't actually deal with in a way that we can overcome the problem. And the number is horrible. The number is scary, right? And nothing suggests that there is a prevention work. Actually, no. So what I'm saying is that, for example, at university research, academic research, what should we do with this kind of database, right? Because we cannot actually get into the army, go there and say something like, you should read feminist theory. Yeah, you should consider the history of suffering of women. They won't listen to any of that, right? Because they have their own thought on the matter. So this should be an example of how we have an amount of information that is growing, that is accumulating, but we don't have actually a system of interpretation that allows us to give procedures to overcome pain. And that's why having numbers, having representations of pain is not the same thing as dealing with that.
My question earlier, you mentioned history and memory. And so you mentioned that sometimes when history is written, some aspects are left out deliberately or not.
A little louder, please.
You want me to start from the beginning?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned earlier when you spoke of memory and history,
Yeah.
when it's being written down, sometimes aspects are left out, whether on purpose
That's
or
right.
not.
Yeah.
Could this be due to an individual desire to romanticize the past?
Mm-hmm.
For example, if we leave the country that we lived in, and had a really bad time, for example, immigrants, Brazilian, or Italians, etc. Sometimes when the first thing they think of are the positives of the past, the culture. Maybe it was, they had a great family, the beautiful landscapes. Are these things? Do they contribute to these aspects that are left out of the negative because we romanticize the past, or is it something else that contributes to that?
Well, the last part of the question is really big, right? Something else. Yeah, there are a lot of things involved in that. But you get into an important point, that is that there are some historical factors that contribute to manipulation of history. So the situation of dealing with nationalism in Brazil is very complex because we have a very, very strong sense of unity. Like all the things that you might listen about, oh, isso é brasileiro, right? Not only like the flag or the hymn, or not only feijoada or the carnival, but a certain sense, a certain way to speak Portuguese, a certain way to construct the thought, some expressions of trivial interaction. And you say this is brasileiro, like this is something that is unique and at the same time predictable, right? So you recognize this as brasileiro. This is very, very important, actually, to the project abroad, right? The interest of Brazil of being able to communicate with the others. But at the same time, this is like avoiding the perspective that might be, for example, you see people in a favela killing each other because of abuse of police and the conflict around drugs. And you say, well, this is Brazil, right? And are you going to this scenario that I was given that is happening now of the genocide of homeless, and you say this is brasileiro? The usual reaction would be in there, you see, I'm talking bad things about my own place, right? The usual reaction would be, oh, this is everywhere. And these problems are around the world. This is not specific from us. So brasileiro is something that is convenient, and nationalism is convenient whenever it's the case. But this idea, it's in shock what you see in front of you. The sense that we can deal with Brazil avoiding contact with pain and suffering is or naive or conservative. Okay? Yes?
Yes. Can you please explain a little further about the genocide of
Yeah.
homeless? Like, what do you exactly mean with that? Who killed them?
The mayor. Well, this is the simple answer, of course. The mayor won't say, I'm going to kill people. What's going on is that, for example, a group of policemen goes to a place in the downtown that is a common place to have homeless people with a fire and having some cachaça, some alcoholic beverage, and they remove them. Removal means eliminate the bodies. And we have like abrigo, shelters. We have shelters in São Paulo, but there is abuse in there, a variety of kinds of abuse, and most homeless don't want to go there. And they are very mistreated and very disrespected. So this removal actually is not news. historically, for example, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, if a woman is going on the street and she's not joining a man aside, she is probably a criminal or a whore or a crazy person, so police is allowed to get and just take her from the street. A black guy who is just walking on the street alone in times that are supposed to be times of work, this is enough to get him away from there and so on. So historically in Brazil, we have a sense that exclusion is not disturbing. Exclusion is unusual procedure. And what happens now is that the process of cleaning is faster, and it's technically more, it's easier. But the point is that the name of this is removal. And the press doesn't want to get in strong conflict with the government, so they don't say much about it. And human rights organizations and people that are, they have empathy, they care. So, for example, in this situation, in September, a group of people who were aware of all that, they constructed a social movement. They went to the front of the building of the mayor to say this is not acceptable anymore. And then the press was there at that situation. But then some days from there, everybody forgot the issue. Well, this is happening as well with like boys in the street, children, a lot of children. And the older people are the easier target. Yep.
Can you explain to us the Brazilian sense of collective memory in today's society?
Yeah. The main point about that might be the opening of the files of the dictatorship. There is an ongoing discussion on what is the expectation of the Brazilian society, because in Argentina we have a much stronger situation with a mature discussion and a lot of documents available for everybody. And in Brazil, this is still a cause of anguish and uncertainty. And the press and the government try by many ways to make people let this go. The first time that a coronel who coordinated torture was condemned was like 3 months ago, because a family, a specific family, asked for repair. But I don't think that you can talk about politics of memory coming from society, right, as a social movement that is strong enough to deal with what is more problematic and is harder to face. What I see, for example, is that society is tired of conservative models. And even if the Partido dos Trabalhadores is not considered a good party for the majority of society, they know that could be a lot worse. So in the elections and other situations, we can see that there might be some confusion, some misunderstanding, but we cannot come back to some horrors that we already had. In a recent election, there was a candidate who was very likely to win, that was expecting to bring conservative religion as law and to deal with concrete problems as sins, and was going to create taxes related to help to God and things like that. So there was like this whole movement of society saying, well, if this is going to win, right, some problems will happen. This is not perfect. So I could say there is this kind of consciousness in a conflicted and contradictory movement, but I wouldn't say that we have like a society dealing with the past like we have in Argentina. It's very, very different. And I think we have a lot to process in this direction. Yes?
I'm glad you brought up Argentina, because I'm thinking about where they are with regards to physical sites of memory and
Yes.
trauma. And as I'm sure you know the ex-ESMA, which was the most notorious, one of the most notorious torture centers
Yes.
during the most recent dictatorship, has now been converted into an espacio de memoria.
Yes.
And what I found to be very interesting is, okay, they have the physical space, but there is still a lot of discussion and disagreement about the language. So you go to the space, even though initially I guess they thought it would be an exhibition space.
Yes.
There's nothing there, but there's a lot there, if you know what I mean. So there's nothing on display, but the space itself is.
Yeah, the space is very eloquent, right? Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, when I go back to what you were saying about the importance of understanding the language of trauma,
Yeah.
and the challenge when you have fragmented narratives
Right.
surrounding trauma, does a physical space always need to have an articulated narrative to speak of trauma and be effective? And will that language become more consolidated with time, or will it just become more distilled and artificial as people come to an agreement about how to refer to even what happened during the dictatorship? They can't even agree on what to call that period.
Yeah. Well, I think we are like in the same point when you ask this. There are two approaches on trauma that are, I think I might mention, and then go to Argentina in this case. There is a professor called Renato Janine Ribeiro in Brazil, who defended the following idea, that we have in Brazil constitutive trauma. That means that we don't have trauma as an exception. We don't have trauma as a specific situation in the process of history, but the colonial process, the predatory process of colonial times, was in itself a trauma, because we can't actually get something good from there as a social experience. And slavery was a collective trauma that is still not enough understood. So Renato Janine Ribeiro understands that you questioned right now, the collective memory, is so unprepared to deal with the images of the past in Brazil that society allows behaviors of the colonial times and behaviors related to slavery to happen now. So it's like a phantasmagory as a social procedure. As we are still, you might know Sergio Bianchi, a filmmaker, who produced 2 movies on that approach, Quanto Vale o É por Quilo and Cronicamente Inviável. There are films about how the past is right now repeating itself in the horror of what happened. And there is Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, who wrote that what happens nowadays in Africa, specifically in Congo, he is paying attention to, is that the extreme violence is the everyday life. There is no rule or exception. What happens all the time, especially for women, is constant exposure to the risk of death. So Zizek argues that the word trauma is not enough for describing Africa, for describing Congo. The word trauma assumes that we can isolate trauma from the rest, and we can try to overcome that. In Congo, actually, there is no rest. There is only trauma day after day. So if trauma is the ongoing everyday life, then you cannot actually think about life as something that you can narrate about. Because the very idea of time is possible because you think about pause, you think about a rhythm that you can organize, that some periods are tense and some periods are more relaxing. And this image of time as something that is balanced, it's not possible in Africa now, according to Zizek. So these two approaches, they are interesting because they are extremely pessimistic, right? They are assuming that trauma is not something that you can overcome, but you have to recreate humanities and you have to recreate the vocabulary to talk about human experience in a way that you can understand how pain is constitutive of the human and not unusual episode. So coming to what you were saying about the space and the narrative, I can assume that the silence is a very, very important resource now in film and literature, and as you were saying in this case of the memory in Argentina, the silence is like very, very eloquent. The silence is able to make people pay attention on the time that is actually not being recognized, the sense of processing things that are things that are so fragmented that you cannot actually, by the first sight, understand how they are related. So silence is a way to say to the reader or to the spectator, yeah, pay attention a little. Just get out of this hysterical rhythm that you are living in because of, you know, money and job and everything. So then you can try to get some empathy with that. And this, like the space that doesn't have any objects or have just a specific way to express silence and express loss and express absence, this might be like a very eloquent way to express now how we are unprepared to deal with the past with our ordinary language. And this is exactly what I was talking about. This is a theory from Marcelo Viñar, intellectual from Uruguay. This is what happens when you have excruciating pain and you are facing the demanding of telling people about it. What I mean is that all the things I am saying here to you are related to a very tough decision. That is, if you talk about the pain in the past, collective or individual, you might face the fact that people are not prepared to listen, and that your language will never be enough consistent with what happened. But if you don't talk anything, then, according to Theodor Adorno, you are allowing people to repeat all the violence over and over. So you need to talk, but you can't talk. Yes?
I wanted to ask a question, kind of a delicate question, paradoxical, I think, in some ways, about returning to the problem of the narrative and the gendered voice in that narrative.
Yep.
And what I'm referring to is, as you refer to the narrative in sort of a very masculinist way, as it needs to be linear, the cause and effect, you know, the sort of...
yes, that's right.
And when you look at contemporary Brazilian women writers, it's kind of become, at least in my experience, kind of a trademark, if you will, for these very powerful, talented writers to break free from what they call sort of hegemonic masculinist discourse, which means, and it's particularly to talk about pain and suffering, whether it's personal or collective. And I'm thinking of Maria Feminto, As Mulheres de
I know, yeah.
And not only in fiction, but also in film, Que Bom Te Ver Viva. And there's some wonderful kind of testimonials that kind of mark the narrative as being nonlinear, right, as being cyclical, or even as subverting conventional notions of what a chapter looks like,
yes,
you know, or what prose looks like vis-a-vis poetry, or vice versa. That has been kind of, consequently, I think, also by masculinist discourse, labeled as experimental.
right.
Therefore, not necessarily canonical because it's sort of out there, experimental. And the kind of contradiction that I deal with when I study this particular issue is the valorization of women writers that are able to break free from this kind of linearity, to talk about pain, suffering, trauma, that is not a linear process, but grief in particular as being, you know, sort of fragmented and in doses, and yet also kind of stereotyping the woman writer in Brazil specifically, but in general, since Helene Sixou and L'Escrita Feminine, about writing what a woman writes differently, how a woman writes differently than a man, etc., as being sort of the property, or kind of like the inherently something about her gendered as female, that would then kind of give a license to write in a non-linear sort of way. You see what I'm saying? So yes. I grapple with that kind of contradiction. I wonder how you study, putting in the element of gender. Do you feel that in your experience, someone like Clarice Lispector, contemporaries or more recent women writers, without necessarily generalizing or stereotyping, collectively are able to kind of communicate these silences in ways that their male contemporaries have not been able to, or have not been willing to do?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, when you talked, I was having in mind Grupo Corpo, a very important group of dance in Brazil. There is a choreography, very strong one, called Onkotô, and a big part of the choreography is about how the body of the woman is capable of a lot of movement, a lot of variety of expressions, and women, when they like touching each other or they're dancing with each other, they look like they are trying a variety of ways of freedom and a variety of ways to deal with growing and changing. And in the other hand, you have male dancers acting like aggressive and controlling and trying to turn women into puppets. And I think in there you have this point that you are bringing in. That is that when you can have feminine discourse that is related to resistance, and this resistance might be collective or individual, meaning that it might go to the private life and might go to the public life, like the experience of women as a political group, and as well the experience of women dealing with hostile patriarchal husbands or fathers. I can actually say that when you have this discourse of resistance, there is a sense of incorporation of elements of this masculine discourse that you were talking about, the hegemonic discourse, in a way of subversion. That means that in some writers, like I would mention Ana Cristina César, and I will mention especially Beatriz Bracher, that I enjoy very much nowadays. They know a lot about masculine writing. They know a lot about how men would approach things, like with the emphasis on aggressivity or the emphasis on control. And they incorporate that in a way that the syntax, the references that you can find in stereotypes of men, the stereotype of masculine discourse, they are changed into something that is like an achievement of freedom by fragmentation. So as long as you can see in her writing how the elements of the repression are subverted, they are confronted by dealing with words, you can find a way in there to change the past as a new construction alternative to the hegemonic perspective.
There are no questions. I would thank Professor.
Thank you.